Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special book-based interview where today we talk to author Aaron Phillip Clarke. Aaron specializes in writing crime fiction novels that explore themes of race, identity, and redemption. He's received not only amazing accolades like being a USA Today bestselling writer, but great opportunities to collaborate with celebrities and activists that we'll get into later. If you're interested in following Aaron's journey, please check out his website at www.aaronphilipclarke.com, his Facebook at Aaron Phillip Clarke, or his Instagram at RealAPCBooks. And as always, if you enjoy these book-based interviews, please drop a like and subscribe. Aaron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Of course, of course. So I love asking authors this first question because I think it kind of drives the tone and the mood for the overall interview. But what made you want to become an author?
Ooh, well, the power of storytelling. So that's kind of I would say that's my go-to answer. There's all kind of nuances with that, but I think being able to tell a story, first of all, it should be I always look at it as it should accomplish three things, right? The idea is the story should entertain, but it also can enlighten and it can educate. And that's always been my approach to telling a story. Obviously, it has to be a good story.
Right.
But I would say early on, it was probably summer school when I was in sixth grade, I think is when I really had this. I realized I had this ability to tell stories, and I had a summer school teacher who would let me write. And I was really into comic books. So I was a huge X-Men fan and Spider-Man. And so I would just draw like when I would finish all my work. So when we had the English block, it was kind of easy for me. So I would, do all my English work and whatever writing assignments we had, and then at the end he would let me just kind of do my thing. And so one day he came over and he looked and he saw what I was doing. And he said, "Oh, you're doing a comic?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm writing this story over here." He said, "Oh, let me read it." So he read it during our snack period, and then he said, "I like this. Now give me another chapter." And so I just kept doing it. So I spent the whole summer just writing chapter after chapter, and he would critique it and give me feedback. And then I was like, "Oh, this is pretty cool." That was the first time I ever had someone in an academic setting for sure take that level of interest in my creative work.
That's awesome. I think there's a huge power when you're in an academic setting and you meet a teacher or a professor or just somebody that kind of takes interest in something that not even you kind of give that full appreciation for. You're just doing it for fun. And you
Hmm.
have somebody next to you that goes, "Wait a minute, this is actually something special. Please like do more." And I think, when you look back, especially going through school or like, going through life and you're kind of figuring out like what you're into, what you're kind of like passionate about, you start thinking about the figures in your life that may have accidentally or on purpose kind of brought that out of you. And, I kind of relate because when I was in college, I had to take this writing course that everybody else could skip because they got a 5 on their AP literature test. I
Uh,
didn't. So they're like, "Okay, you got to take this, beginner writing course." And I walked in thinking this was going to be the worst thing ever. And I came out of it with such a beautiful experience because the professor was all about story writing and the way he talked about creating stories. He talked like as if it was like a life and death matter. I've never met a professor that had that much passion. It was my freshman year. I didn't know what to expect, and for the final, we had to write a short story. And I remember it had to relate to one of the themes of or one of the topics of the course as we were going along, and one of them that really touched me was prison reform and in specific solitary confinement and how we use it in America. And so I wrote a short story about it because I just felt really passionate about it. And, this was also the time where I was really bad procrastinator. So I was up at 4 in the morning. I was upset about the topic. I was upset at life. I was upset being, up at 4. So I just wrote this crazy short story and I just sent it. I was like, whatever happens, happens. And I get a response and the professor says, "Hey, we need to talk." And I was like, "Oh, well, there it goes." Like, I'm gonna go home. I'm gonna tell my parents it never worked out. And I go to the office scared, and he goes, "This was an amazing story. Like, how did you write this?" And I didn't want to tell him the truth. Like, it was 4 in the morning. I was like, "Oh, yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while." And he told me that, that your story writing really captures a lot of emotion. And I really want you to keep on going forward with this. And it really relates with what you were saying because I really love it when teachers see that even when you don't. I think it's so
Oh yeah.
important. And I really enjoy how you were saying that, there's two aspects of storytelling. It's the entertainment side where you're trying to tell something that's really fun and enjoyable for people to indulge in, but it's also a learning experience where you're able to kind of teach people about specific topics, or it's to be more of an educational tool to say, hey, like, while it is fun, there's a message behind all of this. And this kind of leads to our second question. Your bio speaks about how your fiction explores themes of race, justice, identity, and redemption. And I'm sure that there's so many pieces of literature out there that takes different routes, such as, either taking academia and writing papers, or writing nonfiction through the lives of people that have also fought for this in our world. But in your case, you use fiction and the crime genre. And I wanted to ask, how has taking that direction, how has it allowed you to highlight those themes in your own way?
Yeah, I mean, I think crime is really an equal opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of those things where there's an element of crime in every segment of society. And if you really want to permeate all these different segments in terms of the social part of it, and then also the criminal justice part of it, and part of it, a huge part of it, is equality, because who gets justice and who doesn't, right?
Right.
It has a lot to do with who the victim is, and then you also have to look at excuse me, the perpetrator as well, right? So there's this notion, I think, when it comes to crime writing, that it's genre fiction, right? They like to put it in these categories. Well, really, those categories are just created by publishers to be able to sell the books. What people are looking for is a story that touches them, and hopefully they come away from the story with something deeper than that, not just being entertained, but something that actually is going to resonate with them. And so for me, crime really was that early on. I started to see how crime writing is a vehicle to really explore much bigger topics on a macro level. And so, that's, I think that's kind of, and I've always been interested in, you know,
Right.
crime in general, to be honest. I mean, I enjoy law enforcement. I have always been interested um, how crime can shape a society,
Yeah.
and, the ramifications of one crime and how that can continue through decades and generations, how one incident can have that kind of ripple effect. And so I've always been kind of fascinated by that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of crime writing, and that mystery thriller, noir, all of that is kind of, I look at it as all kind of the same. It's under that same umbrella.
Yeah.
But I think the most effective crime writing, in terms of novels that have really had a huge impact on me, have always wrestled with social issues, and have always been more than about what the crime. It's really what the crime represents.
Right.
And I think that's those novels have staying power. You think about Joseph Wambaugh, you think about Walter Mosley, Rachel Housel Hall. Those writers continue. Wambaugh just passed, but those writers, their work is always going to resonate. Wambaugh was writing about police in a way that hadn't been done before, where the point where you don't even see the crime. You're following the officers around, and then you're seeing how the job really impacts them. It was a completely revolutionary approach, I think, to police procedurals,
Right.
because they're not really procedurals; they're really just police stories.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that story. I think, just to break it down a little bit, the first thing that you said that really, got me was, talking about how genres are just options for publishers to sell your novel. And I think, it's really cool how we live in a time where we kind of see those pre-existing genres kind of break down, and we're living in a
Mhm.
world where now it's a little bit more, gray in terms of where your stories align. And I think as we keep on going down this route, I think we're going to start getting used to the idea where it's not as much as the genre as much as the story that you were talking about. And this is also seen in other industries as well. Like, we live in a world where music transcends genres. We're seeing
Yeah.
artists create songs that can be seen as, something slash something. But at the end of the day, you talk to the artist, like, hey, what is it like to be, like, for example, a rock star slash rapper slash pop star? They probably don't even see it like that. They see it as
Mm-hmm.
someone that's just creating work and creating their passion and just being a creative. And I think it's awesome how, you were saying that it's kind of similar for you to be an author. Like, when you're writing these stories, it's not really about quote unquote fiction or quote unquote crime. And, instead it's like using this as a tool to create a macro environment. We're able to, like, bring up identity, bring up themes of race and justice, and kind of, ask, in a way, indirectly ask people questions about what they think about what's going on in their society, what's going on in the world. And I think the beauty of the crime genre, or, just the beauty of just writing stories that have to do with crime, is that it doesn't only teach you a lesson, but it's also an opportunity to kind of challenge your morality a little bit. You're that compass that you've been so used to growing up with. You see a crime where you understand the logic of the person that did it, you understand the pain of the person that's suffering, but the crime itself, you're looking at it, and you can, there's so many examples in life or even in our stories where you argue, I see where this is coming from, but why do I still feel something about it? Why is this still
Mm-hmm.
bothering me? And that is how I really do believe that we start understanding more about the world around us, and we start showing more compassion and sympathy, because we start understanding that, when you look at stuff like crime, it's all about perspective. What somebody sees on one side is not what a person sees on the other side. And it's until you blend those two worlds that you're able to see a much more concise picture of, like, hey, what's exactly going on? Um, there's this TV show called True Detective,
Oh
and
yeah.
I loved the first season with Matthew McConaughey, especially because he does such a great example of being a symbol of that confusion, where,
Yeah.
he's talking to the police officers and he's talking to them like they don't understand him, yet they're in the same employment status. And it's not that he's acting, he is acting cocky because that's his character, but, like, the whole metaphor of that is, how impactful a crime or how impactful the lifestyle can be on one person. And it creates this sense of, you're not going to understand me, so why are we talking about this? It creates
Yeah.
a sense of isolation almost. And, even in that show, you start seeing how the victims also experience their own sense of isolation, because they don't know what the heck happened. They're living in a world where somebody just disappeared and they don't know what's going on. And it could be such a traumatic experience. It's such a heavy concept when you start thinking about how crime can affect somebody. So I think
Yeah.
it's really interesting how you break that down and you kind of explore that, because when you're walking through a bookstore, I feel like you only see the word crime and you just see a bunch of books, and you're just thinking, oh, like, what stories are this? And then you
Yeah.
start reading through it, and then some of these stories you pick up and you go, wait a minute, it's a great crime story, but I'm getting so much more out of it. I'm learning a lot more about, dynamics in society, what the idea of race means, the identity, how do we look
History.
at people, history.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you so much for, talking about how you use crime to help you explore these themes. And, this kind of leads on to our next question. So, I know you're about to release a new novel, The Bluest Night. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Of course.
Appreciate it.
What was it like writing this novel in specific compared to writing your past entries in the Trevor Finnegan series?
Oh, that's a good question. So, I wrote the first novel, Under Color of Law, that introduces Trevor Finnegan. I wrote that, I would say a few years after leaving the LAPD,
Mm,
and I didn't want to write a cop story. I really didn't, because I had already seen.
right.
It's one of those things when you watch Law and Order and stuff, and you think this is just so fictionalized, and it's stuff that just would not happen.
Right.
And I said I just didn't have a passion at that time. Like once I got out, I think it was too fresh.
Mm,
But a few years passed, and then I sat down and I just started working on a chapter. And I said, we'll see where this goes. And then before I knew it, all of this stuff kind of poured out of me that I had bottled up, from that experience. And with that book, I wanted to focus on a police officer who, um, was not going to be kind of the characters like Michael Connelly writes about, right? The idea that these people already from the get go are really doing heroic things. They see themselves as heroes, and that's how they're portrayed in the literature. but I wanted to write someone who was a reluctant
Hmm.
hero. And I needed, because I saw more of that than
Right.
I did, Bosch. I don't know any Bosches. There's a few, but in LAPD, there's not a whole lot of Bosches.
Right.
It's people who are just trying to get through the job and get through the day. And I saw much more of that. And I saw many people who um, were counting down so they could get their pension. That was the reality,
Right.
and I wanted to explore that within a character. So and so that's who Trevor Finnegan really is. Trevor Finnegan is he was a B cop who witnesses something, and tries in that moment to take a stand, and is shut down by the system. And that's when he recognizes that it's not, these individuals are cogs in the system, but it's really the machine that's the problem. But he plays along with it because the idea is that that's the culture. Don't rock the boat. If you play along, maybe you'll get something out of this. And that's what he does. He makes that decision, and that decision comes back to haunt him. And he's forced to have to reckon with his choices, as he investigates the murder of this young Black recruit. So that was the first book. The second book, he is no longer a police officer in Blue Like Me. He's already moved on to being a private detective, and he's still working on redemption. His arc is very much a redemptive arc, and so she's trying to make up for these past misdeeds. And in doing so, sometimes he gets it horribly wrong, like a human.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
I try not to write characters. I like to think of them as literary humans,
Right.
because that he makes many mistakes. And so in this book, and the first one came out in 2021, then 2022, and then I had a break because at that time I was working on other collaborative projects. So I was working with 50 Cent, and I was working on another standalone book, and I went back to Trevor Finnegan. And so I said, you know what, I at least want to finish his complete arc. I want to at least see where he ends up. And so for Blue Like Me, it finds him investigating a possible homicides that are connected to a possible serial killer. And so he's in a different place in his life. He's full on private investigator, but he's kind of drawn into this world of darkness, and it's set in Malibu. And it's this idea that in these homogenous communities, um, there could be something very evil lurking. And Malibu is under policed. It has a generally low crime rate, and has a very questionable sheriff department. And for years, there have been people who have gone missing in that area that you will never hear about. And so I wanted to use that as a platform to explore what could be happening in some of these communities, and what happens to people of color when they venture into these communities and they don't belong. And so, the idea of disappearances, and things like that have kind of been swept under the rug. Well, Trevor finds himself in the middle of one of those disappearances, and it just happens to be. It comes into fruition that it ends up being a homicide, but it is his half brother, who he just learns he even has, is connected to this, and um, the belief is that he may have committed one of these crimes. And so Trevor and his father don't believe it. And as they dig deeper, they uncover what's really lurking in this place that's supposed to be incredibly safe and, almost like a paradise that overlooks the ocean. And it's hides some very dark things.
You sold me. You got me. That's awesome. That sounds like such a not only a very exciting series, but I think this edition with the Bluest Night, I think it goes over a lot of, I think it really expands upon what I think the first and second novel kind of talk about with Trevor. I think the first novel, from what you're saying, I think it does a great job at setting the scene and explaining how Trevor's operating in his police department, and how he is, kind of seeing things, but he's fighting that battle of like, do I stand up for this, or should I just, again, like what you were saying, keep my head down, get something out of it, and move on? And he ends up making that choice. And, in the second novel, he's still trying to find that sense of redemption from whatever choice he made in the first novel. And it kind of eats him up, like you're saying, like, he's human, he has regret, he has guilt, but he's still trying to move on with it. And I think, the third novel kind of it seems like this opportunity where it's like, okay, well, the first and second novel, you see Trevor go through all of these experiences. What becomes of it? And now you add topics like, the half brother. You bring up characters like that where it's like now it's affecting your family. It's affecting your image as a family man. And now you're looking at these communities where you're noticing that, when specific people go into them, they disappear. So it's kind of making you wonder, like, how much of a battle do you need to put in for that? And what exactly are you getting into? Because usually the people that do stuff like that, they're pretty, you don't know what's going on. It's a scary situation, especially in the age today where it's like you have social media and you have technology, people just don't disappear like that. So, I'm sure like for Trevor, when you find out about stuff like this, you're like, wait a minute, like, this has been going on for a while. Like, what is this situation? And I am pretty sure, like, in this story, he's going to have to challenge himself to not only uncover what's going on, but to also wrestle with, what he finds out at the end of it, and to live on with it. Because,
Oh yeah.
yeah, I think that's another thing about the LAPD or just police departments in general is that people don't understand that the crime may be solved, but you still live with what you just experienced. That's like, it's not, trauma is a way to say it, but it's kind of like, it's like getting a stain on you almost, where it's like you've experienced something and the case is solved, but it's like, what does that really do? You have an answer, and the answer may lead to closure for the victims, sure, but it's like, as this person that was actively trying to find out that solution, you go home at the end of finishing a case, I'm sure you're still thinking about it. It's not like, oh, I did a great job, like, all right, let's go tomorrow, same thing. It's more like, wait a minute, like, that sucks. Someone really got hurt, and because of it, now we have a whole party of people involved that are hurt by that. And, that's why there's a lot of respect that I think goes into people that I think dedicate their lives to serving others. And I think that's also the reason why people get upset when you see dramatized versions of it on TV. I think the way that you were talking about Law and Order, I actually talked to my uncle about New Amsterdam, which is like this hospital show, right? And he's a doctor. I go, I think it's crazy that, like, you guys do all of this with the needles and stuff. Like, you guys really do that while they're awake? And he's like, no, like, they're asleep. Like, why would you do that? And I'm like, well, it's because, like, you don't want to mess up their vitals, right? And they're like, what show are you watching? And I'm like, oh, I didn't even bring up the show. And he's like, is it Grey's Anatomy? I'm like, no. He's like, New Amsterdam? I'm like, I'm on season 2. he's like, please, like, don't talk to me about that, because it's just not real. And
Yeah.
I can understand that frustration, because you watch dramatized versions of it and you're like, oh yeah, I understand that. Oh, that's easy. Like, that looks like so enjoyable almost, because it's like, hey, a bunch of friends saving the world, and and then you get into it and you're like, wait a minute, like, there's a lot more that goes into these services of helping people. And
It's
yeah,
a sacrifice.
100% it's a
I
sacrifice.
think that that's at the heart of it.
Right.
Is that it's you sacrifice some of who you are, and there's a little bit of humanity that gets washed away with every case,
Right.
because it's kind of like one of my favorite shows is Luther on BBC. It was Idris Alba plays this just tormented detective, but if Michael Connolly's Bosch is like, his whole tagline is, everyone counts or no one counts. Well, for Luther, it's that he believes all life is actually sacred. It doesn't matter who it is.
Right.
It's all sacred. And whoever takes life is like the antithesis of every good thing that could potentially happen, right? Because when you take someone's life, you're robbing them of their, not just their present, but their future. And so to have that sort of mentality, because he was a huge influence when I was writing Trevor Finnegan. Um, I think for Trevor, he looks at it in a similar way, but it's also so heartbreaking,
Right.
because most of the crimes he investigates are senseless. So having to, investigate and go through the ringer and interview after interview and collecting evidence and going through, and for the very end to be something that just speaks to the senselessness of taking someone else's life, um, is something that erodes so much of who Trevor is. And so that's why I don't think the series will be super long. I have probably one more book,
Hmm.
because I don't think that as a character, and I want him to have a happy ending. I want him to have some peace at the end of it, because if he keeps going, it's I don't see it going very well. I don't know how much he could take.
Yeah.
Like I never set out to just put him through the ringer, but for some reason, every time I sit down to write about that dude, I'm just like, oh man, I'm sorry. Like this is what you got to go through this time. But it's yeah, I want him to have he in the book I'm writing right now, which is uh Blues for the Dead,
Hmm.
which will be the last one. He has a baby on the way, and I want him to have somewhat of a positive ending, somewhat of a happy ending. But I think to get there, I will say this: he's definitely earned it, because he's been through hell. So
Yeah.
he's definitely earned this positive ending, but it won't be without loss. And I think that that's very much very much what it is to be human,
Right.
is that there's going to be these positive things that happen in our lives, but there's also, between that, is so much loss and so much trauma that we just simply have to contend with. And I think that's why I'm always very empathetic with my characters, because and with people in general, because not everyone can manage this the same way.
Right.
And I think in some ways we're all, especially in this country, are living in a crime scene
Yeah.
that we just cannot get out of. It's we see crimes every day from the highest level. We see it, and so we're all having to contend with that. We know it's wrong, but there's something about being hopeless to be able to change it and bring the people who are harmed justice, and having to watch that. That's what we live with every day.
Right.
And so I think that erodes a little bit of our humanity, every time we have to witness that, because we become very nihilistic, and we think, and apathetic, and we think, well, that's sad what happened to those people. you know I mean, we're talking about crimes in terms of environment.
Hmm.
you know Trains that tip over and release toxic gas into the air, and children have cancer now.
Right.
Who speaks for those people? And so we see that nonstop, and it's a repeating cycle of crime after crime that is not. Uh, and when we talk about restorative justice, it doesn't exist for a lot of people. They are not restored; they just continue to be broken, and then they produce more. It's generational, and those crimes ultimately produce more broken people.
Right.
Um, and so I think that that's really hard if you're a type of person who, much like Trevor Finnegan, feels very deeply,
Hmm.
and that will have a huge impact. That's why a lot of the police officers retire. Many of them retire early, or before they actually hit their 20 year mark. They work. They'll be in the academy, or they'll get a desk job or something, because it takes years to wean yourself away from all of that you saw.
Right.
Joseph Wambaugh historically didn't have many friends. He liked his dogs. He had many dogs,
Mm.
but he rarely came out, and he didn't do many book events or anything like that.
Yeah.
He had a very hard time dealing with people.
Yeah.
Very hard time.
Now I can only imagine. I think it's such a I guess it's like a give and take. Of course, you go into it wanting to do the best for people, and it's like you want to be that beacon of hope for those that call you, and you are the embodiment, like taking a position of a officer or just anyone with the law. You're kind of taking on this position of being a form of justice, an embodiment of justice. And I think, from what you were saying, it just made me realize that, like, the same way where when your health goes down, you go to the doctor. That doctor is the beacon of hope, where it's like, hey, like, you're the only person that I can talk to help me get out of this situation. But for a police officer, for a detective, when someone calls you, they're in distress, something bad is happening, and not only are you supposed to, like, absorb all of it, but you're also supposed to solve it, and you're also supposed to give closure. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you get one piece and sometimes you get all three, sometimes you get none, because unfortunately, like, we live in a world where there are some stories that are just forgotten, and there are people that have just been forgotten from their disappearance as well. And I can only imagine the stress and the pressure that comes with knowing that when someone calls you, you're supposed to not only show up the way that you want to be shown up for when when you're calling that number, but it's also one of those things where it's like you have to be proactive in wanting to show that energy where it's like, hey, I understand, I'm gonna help you. And to deal with that pressure, I can only imagine the stress that comes from that. And I think that's the most important part. I think from what you're saying about Trevor is that he embodies everything. It's not just the good where it's like, no matter what, I'm just going to be optimistic because I can save the world, I can do this. He's not a superhero, he's a human, and with
Yeah.
humanity comes that cost of what you're saying, sacrifice, loss, and baggage, that intense baggage where it's like you come home and no matter what you do, it's like you have to kind of compartmentalize it your own way, and then be able to understand, like, okay, like, this might happen again, get yourself back up because this could happen again and again. And I think that's a great metaphor as well for like the situation that we see in this country as well, where it's like we see crime happen all the time, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that are wondering, like, where are the people that can fix this, where are the people that can help with this? And then you see those people, and then sometimes you see that they are either a part of the problem or they're showing that apathy that you were talking about, and that creates further apathy in the people that look up to them or the people that just want to believe that there's someone fighting in their corner. If you see
Mm-hmm.
your quote unquote heroes or the people that you look up to kind of turning your eye away from the situation, what does that really say? It says that you're kind of by yourself. And
Yeah.
when you're living in a society where there's people around you and you want to promote that idea of community, it's really hard to feel it when you see people easily just be like, oh yeah, that's too much work to deal with, I'm just gonna look away. Or, hey, I actually benefit if I keep my head down. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important, to create novels that show that, there are people that really do want to fight the fight. It's just like it's a lot messier than what we think it is, And, I think
Very much so.
right, right, absolutely. And
'Cause, yeah, if you want to crush the spirit of a people, you take away the champions, right? You
right.
take away the heroes. And I think that, Tupac put it best when he was talking about this idea of crime and as it exists, within the Black community or with underserved communities. And he said that they forget
Hmm.
those people need protection too.
Right,
And he said, "Do you think the people who are poor are at home with the killers?
right,
They're not at home with the killers. They need police too, just like everyone needs police. They need help too."
absolutely.
So he's like, just because they're in a building, they're living in a project housing,
Hmm.
you know, and there's about 10 felons in there.
Yeah,
You think that they feel safe?
right,
They don't even want to go out their door in the morning.
right.
They need protection more than a lot of folks need protection. But do they get it? Are they served in the same way? Simply because they have to live within proximity of people who are committing crimes, somehow by default, those people now are no better than the criminals,
Right.
simply because in this case, the only quote unquote crime they committed was that they're poor, you know? And so when we think about crime, we have to think about it in ways that go beyond these kind of soundbite stereotypical approaches to, well, they're over here. Those people look this way. And so they're, in concert with criminals, well, they live in this neighborhood, so they must be part of that problem. If they didn't like it, why wouldn't they? If they didn't like being around criminals, why don't they just move? It's that kind of idea, but they don't look at the beauty of these communities, even though these communities may have high crime rates. People are obviously existing. They've been there for generations, living their lives. They're part of the community. Just because they live in that community does not mean that they're not deserving of justice and protection.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. And I think this is such a great conversation to have because I feel like it's so, important to talk about stuff like this in the time that we're living in right now, where it's like, with the more you talk to people about the situation that's happening either in the world or the situations that you feel about, like, the idea of being overlooked or the idea of not being represented properly in the people that you want to look up to, for especially like law enforcement or just whatever's going on, in the upper levels. It's really exciting to talk to somebody that also feels the same way. And I'm sure for people that watch this, I think is maybe a breath of fresh air to talk, to hear two people talk and be like, oh, wait a minute, like I totally resonate with what you're saying. And I know this was a really dark topic and a dark subject to go over, but I kind of feel like you're also showing a lot of optimism through things like your podcast, the Culture Point podcast. And I wanted to say that the concept of learning the research methods of authors who explore interesting subcultures in books, I think show that beacon of hope, because it shows that while you are talking about possible heavy matters, heavy subjects, heavy topics, it's not coming from a point of like promoting only the ugliness of it. There are a lot of authors that explore the interesting concepts behind it, and to kind of like ask questions about how we think the way that we do. And I wanted to ask, like, how did that start, and what inspires you to keep going on with that project?
Yeah, so actually that was part of so that podcast exists as part of the Authors on the Air Global Network, which is run by Pam Stack. And so she Pam had reached out to me and said, do you want to fill in? Originally I was supposed to be a guest host for kind of one of her other podcasts. And so I said, yeah, I'm fine being a guest host. And then before I was supposed to do that, I had an interview with another author. And so when I had that interview, I guess she had watched and she said, what? Actually, I think I'm just gonna let you do your your own thing and just give you a show. She said, any ideas? And then I said, oh, I don't know if I have the time. I said, like you gotta edit. It takes time. And so I said, well, you know what? I'll give it a shot, and I'll see how it goes. And I didn't want to focus on writing craft and a lot of that. I wanted to look at books that explored um, a subculture or an aspect of culture that a lot of people either might not have readily known about, or something that is so kind of niche, whether it's like I had Brendan Slocum on, and he is a musician, a classical musician, and his novel centers around a young boy who plays the cello and is this prodigy, but his father is a criminal, and his father ends up getting them in witness protection, and it derails his whole entire career. And I didn't know much about classical music, but I thought it was such a cool, I mean, such a cool book. It's called The Dark Maestro. It's one of my favorite books of the year. And ultimately he's able to become something else when he realizes that he can't be this musician anymore, right? He finds a way to still be creative, and still um, express himself through music. And so we talked about, the impact of music, and how that is, somewhat in many ways like writing. You're going to go through different stages, as a musician, just as you would a writer. And so that's kind of what I like to focus on. I mean, most of the time it's authors who are I really connect to their work. I had another author. She was a debut author, Leanne Zhang, and she wrote about the dark side of social media and influencers, which always fascinates me.
Right.
I'm very fascinated by this notion of, what an influencer even is, and the
Right.
fact that they wield so much power and people don't realize that. And they can say anything
Right. Right.
and have a really, really huge impact on impressionable people.
Yeah.
And so I had her on, and she had wrote a really interesting novel about twin sisters, one who is this huge influencer and one who isn't. And then when the huge influencer dies, the one who isn't takes over her identity, and you know does it. And then it begs the question: is it the person who's corrupted, or is it the fact that when you become this influencer and you have all this power. Does that corrupt you? So it's kind of like, what kind of, are you already a sociopath to want to go down that route? you know,
Right, right,
and so it kind of, she asked some really interesting questions about society and the role that, media and social media plays, and how it's shaping, uh, you know, the people who watch it, their lives, and also the people who are doing it, and putting themselves out there, uh, what it does to those people. So it's a fun, it's a fun show, and it's great to talk to authors and have different types of conversations. I think my goal is really to have conversations that uh, again move into areas of culture and not so much about yeah, we talk about, we go to these writing conferences, we talk about craft and crimes all day, right? So I said, I could go talk about that, at any of these conferences,
right.
but what do we not get to talk about sometimes, and sometimes it's these cool little subcultures we explore in our stories.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I also think that it's just super interesting, going back on what you were just talking about with being an influencer. I think the drug of relevancy is very, very prominent in think society where, people will naturally want to stay relevant. And what
Mm,
you're saying is that like people, they're influencers and they're talking to an audience that's extremely impressionable. And I think what's really interesting about that whole situation is I've seen people kind of throw away their, I guess, their want to be a healthy role model to stay relevant. I feel like there's a lot of influencers out there that they notice that they're not getting either the popularity that they want, the fame, the maybe the money or whatever, and so they'll do something to kind of quote unquote like the term rage bait or like clickbait or something. For us it's a
hmm
term, but in reality it is a sense of manipulation that has become so normalized, where it's like things like seeing a YouTube thumbnail that has pictures that that really grab you. It's a marketing tactic. It's like, hey, look at this, and then you click on it, or like or the title says something that is extremely like extreme, and you're like, what, like this can't be real. You click on the video, it's actually not that at all. Like it's like a marketing video for something else. But we're so
hmm
used to the idea that when you look at these influencers, whatever they take for whatever they say is gold. Like it's real. It's always like grounded in reality. And I think that was a similar situation that people had to deal with the internet. And I think it's another thing that we deal with AI. Like how
Oh yeah.
real these things are that we're seeing. It may sound good when somebody or something says something. You're like, oh yeah, that kind of clicks. And then you go into more, research, and you're like, wait a minute, like this isn't it at all. So I think, like for you to talk about cultures and like subcultures that are like existing, and especially with authors that are writing their books, I think it's really unique because people can't write, authors won't be able to write the books that they write without doing the proper research for the subculture. Like if
Yeah.
for the author you were talking about that did the book on social media and the evil side of it, you can't write that book unless you do the research and understanding like what exactly is harmful about social media, what is going on in our society, and what is this, why is this important. And I think it's the same thing with the musician you brought on. What, number one, what is music, and how do we perceive it, and how does that change based on who we are and where we come from. And I think that's really important because I don't think people think about it. I think if anything, we may take it for granted because we see it so much, we just look past it and we just go straight to the end where it's like, okay, well, yeah, that story's great and stuff, but like, what music did you create? Or like, oh, that story's great and stuff, but it's like, what does this mean? Do I get off my phone? Like, do I need to set up timers and stuff? And it's not really about the action. Like, I think sometimes authors aren't really saying like, you need to set up a timer for Instagram for 6 hours, and once that's done, you can never go on the app for the rest of the week. They're not giving you an action to follow. It's more like this is the thinking that goes behind it. From there, you create your own form of action. And I
hmm
really enjoy how the Culture Point podcast kind of touches that because I don't think a lot of podcasts really do that. I think it's more about the end product. Like, hey, you created something. This is so cool. Let's focus on this because this is going to get the most views. Instead, it's more like, okay, well, you created something. Let's go into the details of how you got there because I'm sure there's other
Yeah.
people out there that are also wondering, like, you know, how do I do something like that? Because I think we all have interests that we want to explore. We just don't know where it is, or we don't know how to reach there, get to that point. And so I think that's really great how you do that with the podcast. But you also do that by collaborating with other people with your writing, which is another form of understanding, subcultures in their own way. Working with people like, Curtis Jackson, known as the rapper 50 Cent, or, civil rights attorney Ben L. Crump. Like, I feel like you're also doing that same thing where you're talking to people essentially about subcultures that maybe you're not the most experienced on. So you talk to somebody else that has that, understanding, and you mesh together with them by providing the writing side of it. And I wanted to ask, what is it like collaborating with other people for a novel, especially in comparison to this podcast where you're talking to authors, but here you're actually working with them. Like, you're sitting across the table and you're like, hey, let's make something together.
Yeah, I mean, it varies, right? So you have people who, and I collaborated with a lot of people, some as ghostwritten projects and things like that. Um, but you have people who are storytellers, and then you have people who are consider themselves kind of more like writers. And then you have some people who just have kind of the germ of the idea. And so, I've dealt with people in all different kind of categories. And I think that at the heart of it, there has to be a reason why the work is being written, for me to kind of take it. You know what I mean? Because one really cool thing, working with 50 is that, he already had this idea and he knew what statement he wanted to make with it, as it related to crime, because it's a crime thriller. And so just talking to him, I was able to understand where he was coming from, and so when we collaborated on that book, it was pretty smooth because we had a really good conversation in terms of, and what he was able to provide me, to work with. It was enough there where I said, okay, I get the main theme, the overall theme, and then there's some other, other themes within that, but the overall theme, was going to be this notion of how crime, has these ripple effects, throughout history, though. And so, and how it's hard to determine, uh, it's almost like within that book, it's a lot of themes, but I think within, I mean, it's called The Accomplice, but the idea that, uh, you can approach wanting to do the right thing, um, in a plethora of ways, but every single choice that you make is going to have this, end result. There's going to be ramifications from it. And so that's what that book is very much, explores, the idea that you don't really know who's doing the right or wrong thing. Why people are doing it. They could be doing it for the right reason, but uh, you know, the end result may be awful. Um, even though, and you may have great sympathy for them, but at the end of the day, this idea of, are we really accomplices to each other's crimes at the end, even though we say, hey, I would never do what that person's doing, but in a way, if you don't take a certain action, you're kind of a accomplice. We're all accomplices in some ways to certain crimes that we see happen that we don't say anything or do anything, or allow to happen, um, because either we understand it, or we know the person who's committing it and we turn a blind eye. You know, and so in some ways that's how we get the society we have. It's because we're accomplices. We
Right.
allow certain things to happen.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, I can't believe you wrote that book with 50 Cent. Like, I got to talk to that guy too, because, I just listened to his music and I'm like, wow, this guy's a great rapper. But little did I know that he had an idea for a completely, different idea with like a novel and writing to create something like The Accomplice with you. And I think, yeah, that's such a great message because it kind of, kind of questions, and I think it's a healthy question. Like, what are you accomplice for? And I think, like, you start looking at things that are happening in the world, and I think at some points, like, you start forming your own opinions and stuff. And no matter what your opinions may be, I guess it kind of comes down to, like, whatever you do decide to walk the path down of, like, understanding how you want to understand things, what are you an accomplice to on the sidelines for it? Because I think people don't understand that, yeah, like, individually, the way that I think, sure, it doesn't harm others, but when you start getting a bunch of people together, a bunch of similar thinking, it becomes a movement, and that has a lot more impression. And people don't really understand that your form of thinking can also affect other people's thinking. Humans are very social creatures in the sense where we do, whether we admit it or not, like, we do kind of want to see what other people are thinking about. We do have that natural curiosity for where people draw the line for many things. And I think that book really highlights that, that curiosity that kind of leads towards a definitive answer on who you are as a person and how do you want to carry yourself forward in terms of how you want to operate in your society. And I think that's great how collaborating with other people helps you kind of bring ideas into fruition, because I feel like writing, people see more of a independent individual activity where it's like,
Yeah.
I'm the only one that's touching this thing and I'm gonna release it. But I really love the idea of collaborating, because what you just said, like, 50 Cent, he had a great idea, but I don't know if he's the same author. I don't think he writes the way that he writes his music. He's a different type of writer. And I feel like that was where you're able to fill in that blank, where you're able to offer your services and be, hey, like, I can help you write on this. I really love your story. I think the idea is great. Let's see what we can do with it. And I hope that creates inspiration for other people to do more collaborations. I don't think you should
Yeah.
look at somebody and be like, oh, you're not involved in the writing world just because you don't touch a piece of paper the way that everybody else does. I think if you're able to offer great ideas and you have the patience to translate that to people that are willing to write it for you, and you're able to work together, I think that's a beautiful thing. And it kind of just furthers the idea that while there are times of, like, things may be really rough and there's a lot of things to talk about and maybe stressful, there's also a lot of opportunities for collaboration in industries that I don't think really kind of had that before. And I think that's really great. I know we're approaching, like, the later questions of the interview, but I think it's really awesome how your story involves many people, and it involves experiences of other people that probably aren't able to share their stories the way that you can. And I think that's very honorable, to where it's like, you served in LAPD, you saw all this happening, and you learned so much about the people that have the obligation to provide safety for other people, and you come out of it with a different sense of understanding, where it's like, wait, this is not like how the media promotes it, or this is not how even the people talk about it, because, like, why would you? It's such a sensitive topic. And so I feel like for you to turn all of those stories into Trevor Finnegan and have him go through his journey, and be able to also do the Culture Point podcast, and also collaborate with different authors and other people as well in general that aren't even in the industry, I think it just kind of shows that if you really care about something, there's always going to be an avenue for it, right? Like, it's not just going to be this one way, and if it doesn't work out, then it's never going to work out. There's different facets of it, where if you just care, just in general, if you just care, it provides solutions on its own, where it's like, okay, well, what do I care about? Well, I care about learning. Well, to learn means to, you have to kind of experience something. Do you want to talk to people? Well, maybe that leads to the podcast route. Do you want to create your own thing? Well, maybe that leads to the writing route. Or is it like, I want to do something, but I don't really have the idea, but I have the skill set? That kind of leads towards the collaboration route. And I think that's really awesome how we see all three of that, in your story, in this interview, and I love that. And
Thank you.
Of course, and I think this kind of leads to a really great question. I'm so excited to ask. But, what is your advice to new writers out there that want to release their own book and have that sense of creativity, but maybe they're having a little bit of a problem kind of expressing themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that at our I think at our core we're all storytellers, right? So the comedian who tells a joke is a storyteller. I mean, if you look at the structure of a joke, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and the punchline is the theme, right? That's the overall theme. That's almost like the climax of a story, where you're either gonna laugh or, hopefully you laugh, or you're gonna be like, "Ooh, that wasn't funny,"
Right.
But the idea is that someone's gonna have a reaction, and so I think It doesn't matter the platform anymore. There's great storytellers working in the gaming industry,
Right.
superb storytellers. There's great storytellers who are writing graphic novels and comic books. There's great storytellers who are making music. You know, amazing concept albums are being made. So I think you just have to figure out, as you said, what is the vehicle. And I think that once you have something that you're passionate about, because that's the key, because really writing and storytelling is about longevity. It's that's what it really boils down to is, can you stick with the story long enough to finish it? The greatest gift a writer could give themselves is the power to be able to write the end or finish a project. Because once you finish one, the next one's easier. And then it just keeps getting easier. So, not to say that every book you write is easy, but the process, it gets easier with every single one.
Right.
So whether it's a short story, if you keep writing short stories, they get easier.
Hmm.
If you're writing poetry, you know, the process and how you approach it, you start to come up with your own craft, and your own style and how you approach the work. And then once you build that into your like kind of overall, I like to call it, it's almost like making a soup.
Hmm.
It's like once you know the ingredients, you might next time you might add more pepper, or next time you might add, I don't know, truffle salt, if you want to make something fancy. But the base of it is the same.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, how long the soup base has to cook for. It's 13 hours is the sweet spot. So once you kind of know that, you can, riff on it, you can add stuff to it, you can do whatever you want. And it's a gift that you give yourself. And the only way you get there is from hours and hours of just like beating on your craft and getting better and better at it. That's really what it boils down to. You can't teach people how to write,
Hmm.
but you can help them figure out discipline. You can help them, give them other books that are almost like classes in themselves that they can read and figure out what kind of diction they like. They may say, hey, you know what, I like this writer's style over here. I like Cormac McCarthy's style, this very sparse, archaic type of writing. Or you might say, hey, they might like some of the French noir writers, and the kind of their style, which was also sparse and like to the point and kind of gets at the heart, very short, crisp sentences. You can look at all of that and give that to someone and say, okay, go read this stuff. And then hopefully you can cultivate your identity as a writer, and figure out, hey, what is my style? What do I want to say in my stories? And so that would be my advice, is to read as much as you can and to write as much as you can. Not necessarily with some sort of specific destination. Not saying that I'm going to be published, in the next 5 years, because who knows how long that could take, right? But if you write a story and you like it, you have the power to put it out there. You put it on a website, a blog, social media, Reddit. I mean, now you have so many vehicles to put stories out that is kind of like, it's not the same as it was, 10 years ago. Like, you can put anything, or even before that, I would say like 15 years ago.
Right.
Now you can put stuff out there and it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
I mean, people literally have sold movies, concepts, IP from tweets.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, that's the world we're living in.
Right.
So, I mean, you can get on there and tweet out a whole story and have enough people say, hey, this is really interesting. You have my attention. And they could be wildly entertained by that, and then that can become a movie. So, that's kind of where we're at. There's no excuse anymore, really, for you not to be able to write and find an audience.
Yeah. No, thank you so much
That's
for
it.
sharing that. Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's both reassuring and kind of like daunting in a way, where it's like, it's reassuring in the sense where it's like, hey, there's nothing stopping you, which means that it's only you that's stopping you. And that kind of creates a different frame where, you're kind of looking at situations where you're looking, I feel like people sometimes like, I can't do this, I can't do that because I just don't have the options, I don't have the opportunities and stuff. But like, yeah, you're saying that we live in a world where people can tweet ideas and that becomes a movie idea, you know. everybody has social media, everybody has access to it, a way to type or a way to write. So ideas can definitely become tangible. You know, it doesn't have to just stay in your head. You can put it on a piece of paper, and that's step one. And then you're saying step two is like, how consistent are you with that idea into making it into something special? You know, it doesn't have to be the most perfect thing, but like, you know, you're saying the first time is going to be the hardest part, where it's like you're going through it, you're trying to learn everything to just get to the finish line. And then when you go through the finish line of that project, when you get to the finish line of the second project, it's probably going to be easier because you know what to look out for, you know how to, that you're learning, and you're experiencing a lot more. And I think that's where the reassurance just grows and grows. You know, I feel like in the beginning it's more daunting than reassuring, and then the more you work, it kind of just switches over, where the reassurance kind of takes over and the scariness just kind of subsides. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate you saying that, because I feel like, you know, there's a lot of people that want to experience something and they want to capture a passion and they want to go for it. But I feel like sometimes, you know, they're scared about taking that next step. You know, I feel the same way when I'm doing my writing on the side, or if I'm doing stuff, you know, I feel it all the time. But, you know, it's great to talk to people that have been through it and they're continuing their journey and they say, hey, I was there at one point. It's not as crazy as you think it is. It's just scary, but you can operate under that fear and you can still create something great, and then it's going to go away over time. So I really appreciate that. And, you know, this kind of leads to our last question. I know we talked about book base before. The interview just explained what it was, but you know, essentially, we're trying to create a community around the literature, and you know, we always love talking about book clubs and people that are involved in like socializing around books. And I wanted to ask if you were ever part of a book club, or if you ever socialized around literature with other people, and you know what that experience was like.
Oh yeah. I mean, well, it's a lot of that. But I would say if you ever did a, a grad school workshop,
Oh man.
that's a whole lot of socializing around literature,
Right.
But I would say the most I've ever had to do was in grad school,
Mhm.
because we had to read a book a week,
Wow.
and you had a meeting on Thursday, and you discussed that book, and you had to kind of come and be prepared, and be able to. And that's the thing too, is like that's part of what I was saying before, is the idea that if this is going to be something that people are really serious about, you really have to dedicate that kind of those hours to it, right? And so, you get in the habit, you build habits. Because in undergrad, I couldn't stand reading some of that stuff. Similar to you, like I was like, we had to read Voltaire, and I was like, come on, you know what I mean? How is this going to relate to what's going on today?
Right.
Like I can appreciate it for what it is, but I always struggled when you're having to build a class around that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, Western literature, and having to build that, and you're thinking, how is this connecting to what's happening today?
Yeah.
And so that's what I always would ask every time I read a book. I think, what can I pull out of this that is reflecting on what's happening today?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Voltaire, I mean, there's themes in there that are definitely mirror what's happening, or at least speak to some of the things that are happening today.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you know, anytime I'm teaching and I'm building a syllabus, I want it to be some practicality built in there. So when you're done reading all those books, you could actually say, you know what? I see parallels, and I understand how literature, you know, from this time period is also speaking to this condition.
Right.
It's kind of like the this and that. How does this impact that condition? And so that's kind of how I approach it. But I would say I've participated in book clubs, and I also have, uh, in a sense, presented my novels to them and been a part of book clubs. At the end of the first Trevor Finnegan book, I have questions in there, book club questions, because I always felt like it's very important. And also, I know that for some college courses, they actually use Under Color of Law, in their courses as well. So, I liked, and I did that on purpose because I agree there should be a community around reading. I think that doesn't happen enough because the world is so loud. We don't have those opportunities anymore. Um, People sit down and they don't even think about reading as it used to be a thing. You would go in someone's house and they have bookcase.
Right.
Now it's like, and then sometimes that bookcase, records, tapes, DVDs. We used to, our relationship with media was completely different.
Right.
Now it's like, I'm just gonna get on the internet. It's one thing. Either you're on your phone or you're sitting down and you're on a computer.
Right.
And then that has replaced bookshelves and it has replaced everything, right? And so I think hopefully we're getting back to more of an analog sense where there is a community around books, and that's why I think BookBase is great, because it's building that. And I think that it's something that we desperately need, because community is built around Instagram, even if you want to call that a community, TikTok, it's built around all these things, dances online. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's some of the most superficial things
Right.
that leave you. It's almost like existing on candy. There is literally no nourishment that comes from most of the stuff that is put out there,
Right.
you know. But books are still, as of now, you know, one of the one places that people can gather around is storytelling, whether it be nonfiction, fiction, it doesn't matter.
Right.
It's all stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's true or made up. But we can gather around that and have an experience with each other, you know, in which there's a discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what we're seeing, sadly, is almost the death of discourse. No one talks to each other, they talk at each other.
Right.
But a book basically prevents that from happening, because you all have the same source material. And yes, you'll have different interpretations. Everyone have varying perspectives, but you're coming together around one central work,
Right.
which means it's an equal playing field, right? Not to get on the whole Charlie Kirk thing, but the notion of going to a college campus and using all these little rhetorical methods against college freshmen,
Yeah.
and what you want to do, run rhetorical circles around them, and somehow that is considered genius, is mind blowing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
When it's not an equal playing field, why don't you take a book and have a discussion around that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that everyone is on the same page, and discuss that, why, but instead we, pulling topics from all over the place,
Right.
And making these big declarative statements. And just because it's loud, somehow it means that it's factual,
Right.
And that's not the case. And so I think that's why book clubs are so important. I know No Name has a book club, the rapper No Name, and activist. And so I think Dua Lipa, she as well,
Mm-hmm.
is a huge fan of literature, and I know she's building a culture around books, and I think more people need to do it. I mean, got celebrities and Reese Witherspoon's boutique thing,
Right.
but it's better than nothing. That's how I look at it. It's keeping literature alive, where people can have conversations around stories.
Right.
And Anne Marie has one too, the R&B singer. But I think it's useful.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely useful, and I think more so now than it's ever been. It's important, and hopefully it's something that will continue and only grow.
Yeah.
Especially in the face of what we're seeing nowadays in terms of censorship and not allowing people to express themselves.
Right. Absolutely. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true, and the evidence behind what you're saying with the importance of literature and discourse, literature has probably been existing since humanity learned how to storytell. And you can draw the argument that it starts with cavemen drawing on walls, to Greek philosophers writing on tablets, to where we are now with all these books. And I think it's beautiful how you can go to a library, and whatever you're thinking, the chances are there's probably a book in that building that goes over the same thing you're thinking. And I think we love to think that we're so special, we're so individual when we're living our lives, but at the same time we also need to realize that we're also human, and there's so many ideas that we think are unique to ourselves that in reality have been explored before us, and there's actual evidence of that discourse. And I think, in a moment where I feel like discourse is kind of dying out, I feel like that's exactly when I feel like a revival will happen, because I really do believe the saying where sometimes you only value things when they're not there anymore, right?
Yeah.
We live in a world where we're so, we're flooded with technology, media, noise, like just really crazy alerts going off. I think now people are starting to realize the beauty of silence,
Yeah.
and I think there was a point where it was the other way around, where, back in the day we lived in forests, and then we created towns and cities, so we went from silence to noise, and we craved the noise because that meant progress, that meant sophistication. Yeah. Now it's kind of like sophistication means to be more of a stoic person, to show solitude, to show more isolation, and be able to be more composed. And I think, during a time where, we're seeing, our first right, be challenged, we're seeing the freedom of speech be challenged. I think that's exactly, I'm not trying to say that, like, I'm some kind of like crazy anarchist or anything, but I feel like it's really, I'm excited for what's going to happen next, because I feel like in the moment where things that you really value are threatened, then you start showing up for it a lot more. And I feel like we're going to live in a world soon where people are going to be a lot more vocal about what it means to them. And that's a beautiful thing, because, we just talked about earlier about people that are an accomplice silently for a lot of things that are happening. But I feel like we're going to have to see it. We might see a shift where we're going to see people be an accomplice for things that are worth fighting for as well. Where, in the face of seeing the first, our freedom of speech being challenged, that's when we start talking more. And that's why I really love, I don't watch the late night shows that much, but, seeing what's happening with them and seeing them being so proud about saying, hey, you might take me off the air, it doesn't matter, this joke for me is worth it, or this conversation is worth it. That, I think, is something that I've never even seen. I don't even watch late night TV, I've never been that type of my parents, sure, but like my generation, I don't remember that. Like for me, it was, I played video games, I was doing my own thing. And so, to see that, it kind of made me realize, like, wow, like, there's change happening on any platform, and on every platform even. And I think, going over the idea of discourse again, I think it's beautiful how we always have a need to want to connect, whether it's through an idea or through, a platform, or just a thought of just like, hey, this person's thinking what I'm thinking, I'm not alone in this. I think that is going to be such a driving force, and not only creating book clubs and book communities, but just communities in general, especially in a point where we're so separated. Like, we got to come together, and doing book clubs, seeing healthy role models take the stage and say, hey, this is scary, but it's not impossible, this is what I'm doing, if you would love to join me. And I think by seeing healthy role models, healthy products, healthy forms of literature, the ones that you're creating with people, showing moments of collaboration, having healthy podcasts that go over challenging concepts but breaking it down in a respectful manner for everybody. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from. The words are the same, creating that equal playing field the way you were talking about. I think that is so important, and I really do believe we were going to see that soon, because in a time where that's challenged, that's when you're going to see the most activity for like, hey, wait, this is important for us. So I thank you so much for not only having the conversation about your books and having conversation about everything you've been doing, but to also talk about something that I think is really important. I know you feel the same way about having free speech, and just speaking your thoughts, and not in a disrespectful manner, but in a pure manner where you're like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about the world, like, what do you guys think about this? And I think the more people are willing to just have more honest conversations with each other, I think that's how we create a better playing field for everybody to just enjoy our life and just enjoy the world. But Aaron, thank you so much for being a part of this. Of course.
This has been great.
Thank you. Yeah, no, this has been such a great interview. I feel like I've learned so much already. Like, I think I need to type notes just about this conversation we had. But for others that are watching this episode or this interview, again, if you guys are interested in following Aaron's journey, First of all, please pick up the copy of The Bluest Night that's coming out soon. Please also read the rest of the Trevor Finnegan series. Also, check out aaronphilipclark.com, his website, his Facebook, Aaron Philip Clark, as well as his Instagram, Real APC Books. We will have it linked at the bottom for you guys to check out. But once again, Aaron, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.